the previous videos, I've spoken about our creation in love, for love by God, being created in the image and likeness of God. In the second video, I spoke about the human condition, that we are fallen, ambivalent, wavering towards God. I want to turn now to our redemption, and perhaps an answer to the question that I began the series with: does God believe in you? God's love for us, the fact that He wouldn't abandon us because of our sin and fallen condition, that He wouldn't abandon us in spite of our most culpable or hideous sins, is definitively expressed in the event of Jesus' redemption. And I think something important to bear in mind is to put this in context. There's no compulsion on God. There's no requirement for God to love a fallen and sinful humanity. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, we find glimpses of God's redeeming love. He rescued the Israelites from Egypt. He gave the law. He called the prophets. But in the new covenant of Jesus Christ, we find God intervening in our personal and common history. Now, as John Paul II wrote in Veritatis Splendor, morality is all about Jesus. And if we neglect what Jesus has done for us, then we run the terrible risk of forgetting what Christianity is all about and adopting a legalistic way of morality like the Pharisees of the time of Jesus. Now, I want to come back to the point I made, that sometimes we can take the redemption for granted. But theologian Karl Rahner emphasizes that we did not earn the redemption, nor was the redemption really owed to us. Another perspective on this reality is the theologian Sebastian Moore, who observed that human beings are inevitably faced with a death wish that is beyond our control, something that plagues us and our relationship with God. Yet in spite of that, God's love for us remains constant. And as St. Paul notes, the proof of God's love for us is made perfectly clear by the fact that Christ died for us even though we were still sinners. And in fact, in this redemption, God didn't just love us remotely, but God loved us so much that Jesus came right into our existence and bore the brunt personally of our human fallenness and failing. A good perspective on this is from Sebastian Moore, who said that the crucifixion of Jesus represents God coming into humanity in our worst moments. And I don't think we can understate the horror of the crucifixion. The cross, in all reality, is the worst thing we could ever do. We rejected God. We put the Son of God to death with the worst instrument of torture humans have ever devised. And we not only rejected God, we rejected ourselves. One of the aims of Jesus was to show us what we could truly be. By following Jesus, we could discover or rediscover the true nature of a human being, to be someone living as an image of God. In other words, in Jesus we find our true destiny. But in the crucifixion, by rejecting Jesus, we also reject our true selves. As Sebastian Moore put it, and I'll quote, "The crucifixion of Jesus then becomes the central drama of man's refusal of his true self." But the radical message of Christianity, the scandal of Christianity, if you like, is that in this very tragic moment of humanity's ultimate distress, that God doesn't condemn us, but God redeems us. In this event, everything changes. And Sebastian Moore puts the point beautifully in his book, The Crucified Jesus is No Stranger. He recalls the time that he got it. He said it was the Feast of the Sacred Heart, and they were singing the first anthem of Vespers. One of the soldiers opened his side with a spear, and immediately there came out blood and water. Quietly, and with a part of the mind that does not wrestle with concepts, I knew that the whole thing was there, the act of aggression, of sin, releasing the waters of grace. The contradiction, the contrast that we see in the crucifixion is that it's the superlative redemptive act of God because it takes on the fallenness of human beings. It engages our sinfulness and transforms this event into an event of universal forgiveness. The reality expressed there is that even in our worst moment, in the moment that summarizes the worst of humanity, God makes the ultimate statement that he loves us and embraces us as his own. In the redemption, God manifests the victory of his forgiving love even over the refusal of his own people. And so the whole of human history in this one tragic yet forgiving redemptive event is now definitively under the forgiving love of God in Christ. To put this in slightly different words, in the redeeming event of the crucifixion, God is telling us that even in our worst moment, we are still loved and accepted by God. The implications, of course, are just as real for us today as they were for the people present at the actual crucifixion. Living in the Christian life means, and I don't mean this to be too negative, because it's got a very positive aspect, but Christian life means making the self-discovery of oneself as a crucifier. That's why for Catholics we all read out the parts of the crowds at Good Friday liturgies. As Sebastian Moore puts the point so well, the significance of the historical crucifixion is that which we kill in our brokenness, our rejection of God, which we do in a clandestine way in the dark, is what we've killed and rejected clearly in the light of day. But then what happens? God's unlimited love comes to us. When we own ourselves as crucifiers, we own the fact that we have in fact rejected God. We discover not condemnation, but God's unbounded love and acceptance. Because in the crucifixion, God definitively says to us, despite your worst failings, I still love you. That's the radical message of Christianity. Now, the paradox of the redemptive sacrifice of Jesus has many implications. One that I want to explore is that through Christ, humanity is brought back to the Father. And just as the death of Jesus was ironically his victorious return to the Father, so too it's our reconciliation with God. We too return to the Father in the redemption. The Father's acceptance of Jesus is extended to all women and men, and that's manifested in the resurrection, which assures us of the Father's pleasure with Christ and his approval of Christ. The resurrection assures us, among other things, of the eternal value of the redemption that Christ has brought us. So this redemptive event of the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus assures us of a new covenant of grace that is poured out on all humanity. In Christ, sin, fallenness, human weakness, these have no ultimate power over us. But what Jesus has done is given new life, even to those who crucified him. The life of grace is the life of infinite forgiveness that God gives us.